Um, good morning, good afternoon, actually, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leela Gandhi. This is just a very brief forward to the events this afternoon. I'm absolutely thrilled that Omar Kasmani will be giving the inaugural lecture in the Religious Epistemologies lecture series, co-curated by Vazira, Zamindar, and myself, and part of the Humanities in the World initiative at the Kogut Institute for Humanities. This particular lecture series features scholars, writers, artists whose work engages and exemplifies forms of knowledge based on belief, and which are often, though not exclusively, associated with religious outlooks. And I will give over now to Vazira to introduce Omar.
Hi, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Omar. With flowers in full bloom in the city, Omar Kasmani, in collaboration with a beloved colleague at LUMS in Lahore, organized an electrifying 3-day workshop in March 2019 called Queer Futures, Politics, Aesthetics, Sexualities. Students packed their rooms, and the conversations there gave form to what might now be regarded as a long fought for, fiercely urgent queer turn in Pakistan studies, or more broadly, thinking with South Asia. From that workshop, an edited volume called Pakistan Desires, Queer Futures Elsewhere is forthcoming from Duke University Press later this year. Today, Omar Kasmani is here to talk to us in relation to his extraordinary ethnography, Queer Companions, Religion, Public, Intimacy, and Saintly Effects in Pakistan. And this book came out last year from Duke University Press as well. It is an ethnography that is centered on one of the most beloved shrines of South Asia, of Lal Shahbaz Qalandar of Seven Sharif, where the intimacy of its fakirs with the antinomian saint bloom in Kasmani's pages. Based on fieldwork in Seven, spanning nearly a decade, Kasmani argues that queer in this project isn't strictly, to quote, a figure of sexuality. It serves rather as that capacious hermeneutic by which we come to read not so much religion queerly, what a project of queering Islam might demand of us, but rather, and this is important, but rather reading queer religiously, reading queer religiously. Omar Kasmani is an anthropologist located at the Collaborative Research Center for Affective Societies at the Freie Universität in Berlin, Germany. His work is situated across the study of contemporary Islamic life worlds and queer and affect theory, and it queries critical notions of intimacy and post-migrant longing. His other recent publications include Futuring Trans in Pakistan, which appeared in Transgender Studies Quarterly in 2021, and Critical Thin, Haunting Sufis and Also Here of Migration in Berlin, which appeared in Religion and Society 2021, and in many ways anticipates his ongoing work thinking with post-migrant Berlin. Without further ado, a warm welcome to Omar, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for this very thoughtful invitation, but also this really generous introduction. It's truly a delight to have the opportunity of discussing my book with friends and colleagues at Brown. And thanks especially to you, Vazira, Zamindar and Leela Gandhi for having extended the invitation in the first place, and to Ben and Hannah for all the support in organizing today's event, and to those attending as well. I'm really grateful for the interest in the book, and very much looking forward to your comments, questions, and feedback. And what I'll try to do with the talk is to give a broad overview, more like a book talk, since the book is still new. And hopefully you'll get to read the book. It's an invitation to read the book for the juicy ethnographic bits, but I will make sure to read a bit from the book itself to give a flavor of the ethnography itself. So we could pull the slides, please, Hannah, and already move to the next one. Thank you. Writing on Islamic saints and saintly space in Cairo, Amira Mittermeier, who's an anthropologist of Islam, observes how saints' places, with their concentric circles of sacred affect, but also as doorways to other realms, excite and uphold a non-linear spatial arrangement counter to the checkerboard order of modernity. In one of her texts, she makes the queerly delicious statement that shrines break the order of straight lines. A somewhat comparable challenge to linearity prevails in Anand Taneja's ethnographic rendering of post-partition Delhi's saintly ecologies. Here, not just saints, but the co-presence of Islamic jinns, Hindu deities, anonymous spirits, and talking animals disrupt neat conceptions of historical time and religious belonging in a post-colonial setting. While learning from them, but also distinct to theirs, my intent with Unstraight has been to think queerness in and through religious life worlds. I have described Islamic saints as queer companions, not as mere provocation, but to bring home the greater point that affective intimacies with saintly beings, figures, and places bear affordances that betray the straight, that these are affordances that involve departures from established religious lines and social norms in present-day Pakistan. Now, those of us who study Islam know that religious deviance, unstraight modes of piety, and crooked orientations to society are part of the ways in which Muslim mystics have historically expressed their inclinations towards the divine. Ahmad Karamustafa's work on Qalandars of the Islamic Middle Period, or Shahab Ahmad's discussion of Mazhab-e-Ishq in his book, What is Islam, are compelling examples to think of and with. Such histories of Islamic waywardness, if I may call them, which are both plural and diverse, inform my interest in parsing the saintly modes and religious means by which a certain unstraightness coheres in the present. This refers, at least in particular in relation to my book, to the capacity of enshrined holy figures, no matter their religious affiliations, to alter our relations with history, as well as preserve possibilities of staying temporally aslant to the contemporary. So this notion of intimacy and temporality, this is a key insight that unfolds through my book. Next, please. Such leanings and learnings are tied to my decade-long research in Sehwan Sharif, a much revered and ancient town, a site of multi-faith devotion in Sindh, Pakistan. In fact, I would say that nowhere in Pakistan is the sacred as dense and unstraight as it is in Sehwan. I'll tell you what I mean by that. This location on the Indus River is a formerly Shivite and now Sufi site of pilgrimage. The word Sehwan, local historians will tell you, comes from the word Shivvahar, or the village of Shiva. The place acquires a Sufi reputation around the 13th century. That's what historians have argued. Today in Sehwan, one old world deities and demons from another world crossfade with their Islamic contemporaries with incredible ease and little lag. The town is home to the shrine of Pakistan's most beloved figure of devotion, Lal Shahbaz Qalandar. Now, Lal, like Sehwan, is a figure that straddles multiple histories and identities. He's also remembered in as many guises. An ancient river deity who rode on fish, synonymous with the legend and figure of Julelal, a Shi'i Ismaili proselytizer of the 13th century, an awaited reincarnate for the Hindus, a wandering antinomian Sufi who rose to the skies in the form of a falcon and hence called Shahbaz. What I'm trying to convey is that in a country like Pakistan, such plural narrations, of course, do not sit straight with the modern nation state's desire for, but also its attempts at, creating singular or exclusive Islamic pasts. Such historical complexity, or this kind of sacred density that Seven represents, informs part of the broader ways in which I conceptualize queerness in the book. And for this, I rely on Fakirs. Next, please. My interlocutors are women, men, and gender variant ascetics who abandon home, question inherited lines, and forego reproductive economies of family and work. Most of these figures, at least the ones that I've worked with, are drawn from across the country and are led to Sehwan on the basis of dreams and visions. And many of these perform as healers and spiritual guides to pilgrims at the shrine, but also in the town at large. So in many ways, Queer Companions is a collection of Fakir life stories. The book's chapters narrate Fakir lives as these unfold in particular locales in and around the town, but more importantly, in excess to ascribe lines of the familial and the social. So in one of the chapters, for example, an unchaperoned mother of 8 traverses a cross-country geography of shrines. In another, an intersex child abandons home on the promise of the state and on the basis of dreams. I also write about an ascetic who gives up celibacy for a girl he loves, or a woman who contests place among the dead in a graveyard. Now, in assembling these life stories, my book offers the insight that such betrayals of the straight, this way of questioning family, society, going off track, so to speak, takes place on the basis of people's growing bonds with Islamic saints. These are figures who actually return these unstraight affections, so to speak. As I note in the introduction to the book, part of what I'm pursuing here, refracting queer affect through saintly archives and Sufi religious matrices, is the epistemological work of regathering intimacy in ways that do not squarely home in its Euro-American genealogies or in queer's secular orientations. I read intimacy in very Belantian ways, but via the Urdu and Sufi notion of qurb. Next, please. I won't repeat the long meditations on intimacy that are present in the book, but I can say that to be qareeb, one of the words I use, let's say the one who bears the qurb of the saint, points to an always evolving, never stable feeling of being close. So the word qareeb basically just means close, but I'm using it with this affective lens of qurb, which of course it's etymologically tied to. So more than just a physical marker of nearness, such being on the verge takes intimacy as a temporal account of affectivity, the never knowing of relations in the present, the future such intimacies disclose or foreclose, the socio-historical relations they can expand or frustrate. These are questions that my book tackles with regard to intimacy. It illustrates how saintly bonds turn affective formations that tie individual, society, and the state in a public architecture of intimacy. One of the contentions my book advances is that saintly intimacy is sustained by the material, affective, and public infrastructures of the state in Pakistan. So in the next slide, we'll see that the cross-reading of affect and governance that I have pursued, especially in chapters 1 and 2, is tied to how I understand the Pakistani state's relationship with saints. So religious shrines, as some of you might know, are public institutions in Pakistan. These are sites that have been nationalized, at times confiscated from traditional custodians as part of the state's modernizing move that was initiated in the early 1960s. So in this particular regard, I find it important, and this is what the chapters do, is for my readers and listeners to grasp the often inseparable or very obscure dynamics of governing saints and governing with saints that are at work in Pakistan. And I try to tease that out. So for example, set in a grove outside Sehwan, Infrastructures of the Imaginal follows Baba's life story to reveal how an administrative presence of the Pakistani state at saint shrines like Sehwan extends into wider imaginal modes of dream, song, and image. So it's more than just revenue generation or symbolic, governance, but it's about how the state's overlapping pull can, with all these modes, can draw fakirs, but also other pilgrims to find an advanced affective access to the saintly. The following chapter is situated in the tomb hall of the shrine itself. Her stories in his darbar revolves around the questionable authority of a woman fakir, Amma, in a men's prayer space. It illustrates how women's spiritual careers are secured and advanced by the state's arbitrating role at public shrines. In fact, one could argue that in replacing the authority of the traditional custodians, the state opens up non-customary access to saints and the saintly, a move that can be read as a limited democratization of shrine space. The provocation at work in this pair of chapters is that as fakir come close to the saintly in Pakistan, they're also drawing nearer to the state. Next, please. In chapters 3 and 4, I've argued that saintly intimacy hinges on critical performances of the body, which is to say that one's closeness with saintly figures and locations is corporeally afforded. So through an extended discussion of affective corporeality, I argue that it is a public performance of fakir disguise. So the concept I use is base, which means guise and disguise. And it is that which affords and sanctions one's departures from socially inherited lines, objects, and situations. So very simply put, one has to look like a fakir to be able to be read and understood, and for that life to be validated in the public eye. Following the life of a woman fakir, Zahida, in Other Guises, Other Futures, is a story of crisis as it unravels in the shrine courtyard. It points to how fakirs tarry with tormenting and turbulent relations. These are intimacies that span spheres of the domestic and the public, the familial and the saintly. So Zahida's life story illustrates her crisis or her failure of base or performance, let's say, the corporeal performance. But it also illustrates much of what happens when saintly orientations fail, become difficult or obstinate, or when intimacy no longer affords what it might have once promised. Love in a Time of Celibacy traces a scandal at a fakir lodge in the town, where the lodge's most prominent fakir finds himself caught between his devotion to the saint and his love for a woman. Through Murad's scandal, we come to understand how saintly bonds can come undone or show signs of disaffection, especially in the face of rival intimacies or competing objects of desire and devotion. So whether a married woman, Zahida, or a celibate fakir, Murad, such conflicts around intimacy, body, corporeality reveal how sexuality and sacrality are complexly conversant in fakir bodies, along with the ways in which ideas around sexual intimacy actually shape fakir understandings of saintly relations. Next, please. A more dispersed idea in the book, and taken up only in chapter 5, is what I describe as worlding with saints. Through the story of two fakirs contesting place in a graveyard, a man and a woman, I describe how coming close to saints means coming close to displaced histories or histories that are not readily available. So very much in line with Anand Taneja's work. So, really a companion piece to his book, I would say. The chapter illustrates how fakirs ally with more than living beings and mythic creatures involving more than Islamic traditions. Here, intimacy becomes that interface through which multiple, at times unresolved or irreconcilable histories of the post-colony can whirl together or have a stake. Such affective attachments with deceased saints and their tombs, then, is less an act of rejecting the world in my book as is commonly perceived, more a means for becoming worldly. So worlding with saints basically suggests that the very intimacy that winds up fakirs in complex ethical political relations with saints ensures also that saints, though interred into the earth, can have an affective stake out there in the world. Next, please. So what I'll do now is read two sections from the book, one from the introduction, and this is about Zahida, who's my favorite fakir, so to speak, but she also because she's really led me to the work. She's led me to the concepts that are there in the work. So what I'm reading is about my first encounter with her. And then the story of her is a story of crisis, and I'll read a section from the chapter which is dedicated to her, which is chapter 3. And I will read the last part of it. So it's like my first meeting and my last meeting kind of her. And in the middle is a long story of crisis, which I invite you to read in the book. So next slide, please. And we see an image of my first meeting with her, which I didn't know would be so consequential, but I was supported in the field by a very dear friend of mine, Marvi Mazhar, who can also be seen in the picture. And she had the wonderful idea that she got a chaiwala, like a person selling tea, to take a photo of this moment. And this became a moment I wanted to now return to. So I'll read from our first meeting and from the introduction. Our lines had first crossed on the white marble floor of the shrine courtyard in July 2009. By late afternoon that day, the heat was giving way, and suitably enough, the general mood at the shrine had turned leisurely. Clusters of women were hanging out under the open sky. As I singled out Zahida for a chat, I had assumed her to be like other women at the shrine, that is to say, vow-making women in pursuit of healing or improvement in their everyday circumstances. A great deal of that was true because female pilgrim narratives and women's motivations to be at saints' places were largely marked by familial disputes and personal tragedies. Many of these were accounts of illnesses, afflictions, family hardships, possessions, and evil spells. Zahida's purpose, as I would come to learn that afternoon, was unlike that of most women. She was a fakir, or better still, in the line of fakiri, as she herself put it. At the time of our first meeting, Zahida was in her early 40s. She had been married for about 25 years with 8 children and belonged to a middle-income household. Intrigued as I was by Zahida's singular purpose and circumstances, I remember being equally amused by her choice of the English word line in an Urdu conversation. Line wasn't a limit, a thing to cross or transgress. It was a figure of orientation in Zahida's use. I've lost the line. It was a figure of orientation in Zahida's use, a thing that distinguished her from other women. More compellingly, in the statement of hers, to be a fakir was not so much to be someone as it was to be going somewhere, a path to something, a line which in Zahida's description she had been precariously attending to for over 7 years. I'm very close to him, Zahida had remarked in one of our early exchanges. What sounded like a somewhat ordinary statement carried a pronounced sense of achievement. She had backed it up with a quick mashallah, as if to protect herself from her own sense of pride or the evil eye of others. Her use of the word qareeb signaled her distinction from other women and her chosen status in relation to Lal, the saint whom she had simply referred to in the third person, him. Qurb, from which the word qareeb derives, is a concept that stands for affective nearness and conditions of intimacy. Thus, to be close in this instance is not simply to be nazdeek, the other Urdu word for proximity, which would speak to her physical location in the shrine courtyard in relation to the tomb of the saint. Qurb additionally portrays Zahida as a bearer of Qurb, the one who has found closeness to the saint in emotional affective terms. It is such intimacy that distinguishes fakir figures from ordinary pilgrims and enables them to perform as intermediaries with the saint and spiritual guides to the followers. In evoking the figure of the line, not only had Zahida evoked the question of being oriented, but being in line also meant awaiting an outcome. Being close or near in this sense was also to be nearly there. 7 years into her pursuit, Zahida, at the time of our first meeting, described herself as on the verge of accomplishing her fakir goals. She anticipated that things were about to settle. In other words, to be close was to be imbued with a sense of futurity. What followed, however, through the course of my research was contrary to Zahida's expectations. Her protracted stays at the shrine regularly invited her husband's displeasure, keeping her occupied with domestic trouble. In the years to come, she would question her marriage as well as the fakir pursuit. She would fear the loss of lines, and the saint's affection toward her become riddled with doubts and dilemmas. And these are the conditions I take up in chapter 3. And what I will read, as I said, would be the last part of that, the closing bit of that chapter, and it's called Her Line to Loneliness. Zahida's metaphor of the line has helped articulate how to follow a line like a fakir is to become invested in that line and also to be committed to where it will take us. The capacity of orientations to draw us in certain ways, to take us somewhere other than here, is forever courted with moments of orientation's many failures, unorientations, or instances and occasions when fakir intimacies discontinue, weaken, or are fakir weaken or are rivaled by other objects of desire, or when relations do not quite deliver the rewards they might have once promised. Thus, also through a long account of Zahida's labor as a fakir, we're able to read how failures to maintain conditions of a specific intimate relation, that is, losing sight of the line and where that line would have taken us, involves, in Bellant terms, a slipping away of objects that anchor us in the first place, and an accompanying cluster of promises previously reachable. Zahida's statement in 2013, when one becomes a fakir, one becomes lonely, had come at a time when she had tested the waters for almost 11 years. Loneliness, as she had described in this particular moment, stemmed from a social failure, the isolating experience that comes with a gradual realization that not many around her could comprehend or appreciate her reasons to pursue saintly objects, especially when progress was slow, if not also unyielding. Being in the fakir line had also meant constantly being at odds with what came predetermined for her as wife, mother, and woman. Fakirs like Zahida were regularly reminded that not only were their extra domestic pursuits questioned at home, unaccompanied women at saints' shrines were additionally subject to greater public scrutiny. They were also not welcome in the all-male circles of fakir lodges. Zahida's loss, inasmuch as it persists, also involves a loss of futurity. What prevailed in our final exchanges in 2013 was how she was dealing with her relation to an object of attachment under compromised conditions of intimacy. If her descriptions have taught me how being a fakir is being in the line of something, she has also shown how deviating is in itself a commitment to a different line. Her struggles with pace show how lines of reorienting or returning were no less arduous in emotional and affective terms. They also reveal how being in the company of saints is a material, corporeal project. In other words, saintly intimacy hinges on critical grammars of the body, whose successful performance serves to establish one's closeness with saintly objects and locations, as well as to mandate one's being out of step with straight rhythms of the social. Failures of intimacy or worsening saintly relations, inwardly tormenting as these are, take very public forms. At the time of our last meeting in November 2013, Zahida was treading a thin and fragile line between finding recognition and losing respectability. Without her fakir base or guise, the temporal and precarious character of her pursuit was made visible, and she had found it difficult to validate her unchaperoned presence at shrines. Whether she would in fact return to the folds of domestic life is a question that remains unanswered. What became clear, however, was that there were no lines sanctioned for her as a woman that involved destinations other than the home and saints' places. At the time of our first meeting in 2009, Zahida was in the line, oriented and in place. And 4 years on, it was clear that to have no lines to follow was to be going nowhere, and to be without lines was to be without place. Zahida's pursuit of intimacy, as it would unfold before me, would also become the raison d'etre of this work. Orientations of the researcher and the researched were indeed distinct, yet lines of work and our labors toward making those lines work, of research and of fakir being, intersected in these years as much as they parted or ran parallel to each other, though it is Zahida who has shown the path. She has illustrated how being in the wake is a form of endurance, so long as it means to tarry with objects that a line may bring into view, to remain attached to the futures it may preclude or involve, more so, a means to continue in the face of intimacy's impending loss. So I'm going to return and take a few moments to talk about what it means to think queer and religion in tandem. So next slide, please. The ambition of this book has truly been to explore whether queer theorizing can find other lives in the epistemological reserves and affective resources that religious ecologies and life worlds make available to us. And a lot of it also is tied to my biography. And I'm now, after the book, also trying to write that personal story, of growing up in a religiously observant family and figuring out queerness over the years. So how these two are companions also in the sense of my life. But sort of in the book, the question is this: can religious concepts find grounding in quintessentially secular sites of queer theory, which are shaped in the first place by religion's presumed absence? Or to lean on Arondekar and Patel's argument in Area Impossible, how might we overcome theory's geopolitical bias that already determines why places such as Pakistan or settings like religious shrines, locations I write from, with, and about, do not strike us as possible sites for queer thinking or world making? I hope it is clear to my readers and listeners that the intent of my book is neither to rehabilitate queer and religious tradition, nor it is an anachronistic move to repair histories. It is not satisfied by queer jacketing religion either, that is to say, over-reading scripture or tailoring religious life worlds to a queer cut of our choice. My proposition to think religiously does not entail a frenzy of finding one in the other, Islamizing queer or queering Islam, but involves the intricate task of exploring a companionship such that scholars categorize religion and queer both can remain in creative suspense, or at least question their historical disinclination. So reading queer religiously incites a troubling of religion as a non-definable, Eurocentric, and a colonialist category in much the same way as it imagines queerness in more than rights-based, non-metropolitan, extra-secular, and beside Euro-American cultural terms. Following Donovan Schaefer, I understand religion as a bloom space. Thus, queer, when conjured through sacred aesthetics and religious affect, is no longer just a designator for non-normative gender and sexualities. It is additionally that device by which we are able to ask ourselves whether queer history is always only a history of queer activism, narrowly defined LGBT rights, and so on. Or are there ways of thinking more capaciously, let's say a history of queerness that makes up space for and is made up of other, in this case, distinctly religious ways of being unstraight in and to the world? And Fakirs, I believe, show us precisely that. Next slide, please. In this final section of my talk, I return to a set of photographs, which, as I discuss in the opening pages of the book, had led to a heated argument with my mother. Again, going back to a bit of the biography. It is in fact a photo template in which a photographer for hire at the shrine had artificially inserted my image alongside the saint of Sehwan through computer-aided techniques. Pictures like these were popular mementos. The one featuring Benazir Bhutto and the saint was an all-time favorite. So was this one with Bodlo. Next slide, please. And Bodlo is the saint's most favorite disciple. So on the left side of the composition is a particularly affectionate scene. Bodlo has his head resting in the saint's lap, while the saint's body is seen leaning forward, his palm securing the disciple's head in a loving embrace, so close that his body is almost indistinguishable from the body of the saint. On the right side is where the pilgrim's figure is usually inserted. Next, please. What would tip things over with my mother was a different iteration of this image in which Bodlo's face had been virtually replaced with mine. Now, in this version, I was no longer just an onlooker standing next to an affectionate scene between saint and fakir. I was the one in loving embrace with the saint, my head securely placed in his lap, my body queerly close to his, arguably too close for comfort. Now, interestingly, people at the shrine read the embrace as the saint's approval of my research, and some couldn't stop commenting on the likeness of my face to that of the saint's disciple. But as I shared the photograph with my mother, I had counted on her good humor, just as when she had reacted to other pictures, for example, the one with Benazir. But to her, and I should add that my mother is not a believer in saints, the saint's affection in the photograph was still neither dormant nor laughing matter. If not the power of saints, which my family did not believe in, the power of intimacy here in my reading was unmistakably compelling. Using the English words line and cross in an otherwise Urdu sentence, a bit like Zahida, but with different connotations, my mother remarked, "A line has been crossed." That shrines were frowned upon at home was hardly news to me. Invoking saints or seeking their assistance had no place in the reformist version of Islam I had grown up with. A visit to a shrine, however ubiquitous, never featured in our daily lives. Venerating saints was in fact shunned at home. I was also aware that my growing involvement with Sehwan as a site of intellectual inquiry and my constant discussion of its affective emotional life worlds evoked all shades of anxiety at home. It wasn't their views on saints and shrines that struck me, rather a paradox that shone through my parents' micro-anxieties. Saints allure that my family so vehemently rejected, harbored as if a futural property, enduring affects born, if not from their remote acting beyond the grave, as is commonly believed of Islamic saints, then of my more deliberate and immediate ways of coming close to them. Here, again, intimacy or closeness, even if digitally doctored, conjured up my parents' worst fears that I might be believing in the saint, or that such intimacy was introducing new or unstraight historical objects, ones which did not extend shapes of our religious inheritance. In short, saints were risky companions, shrines a risky business, and a simple photograph, in this instance, a harrowing record of a wayward affair. Whether the saint embraced me or I embraced Sevan, the photograph now stands witness to my own labors of coming close, crossing far. Queer Companions captures an entire decade of arriving and departing, staying, coming to know and not knowing enough. Questions of intimacy I sent in this book are somewhere, somehow, also inflected by my own coming to terms with distance, both physical and emotional. Or the queer affects I identify in relation to Fakir lives are in part to make sense of all that I might have stirred up and upended or given up in the wake of coming close to Sehwan. If anything, Fakir labors of love have taught me that coming close to an object always means becoming remote to certain others, that intimacy involves political moves with ethical stakes. Theoretical labors put aside, all scholarly citations taken away, what remains at the heart of this book are stories of coming close, ways of worlding shared with me over the years, some also as parting gifts. Through the labor of writing lives and piecing together biographical fragments, I'm constantly reminded of the limitations I face in terms of access and material, the temporal character of life itself, as well as the constructedness of the ethnography as a genre. Murad, a Fakir interlocutor of mine, who once suggested that I ask less questions, also told me that he wants to be like me, an explorer who travels to new locations, he said, not to record stories of others as he described my work to be, but to write his own story. Somewhere between crossing far and coming close, along labors of finding, accessing, composing, and telling Fakir stories in, across, and between these pages of this book, I hope to have found a story of my own to tell. Thank you very much for listening.
I'm bursting with questions. Of course, we have the pleasure of Omar's company in Vazira and my sort of seminar on belief. But I suppose maybe if I may ask you a question while we are waiting, Omar, that was a very, it really gave a glimpse of the richness of your extraordinary work. Let me ask you the straightforward question about queer and religion, that I understand. Is it necessary? Is it necessary to divest queer of sexuality for it to do the work that you are making it to? Because there is, I understand the work you are doing. I mean, in making theory more capacious. You know, I get that, but I just wanted to draw you out because there are constantly scenes and metaphors of sexuality. So just that question of sexuality, I think, I wanted to draw you out.
Thank you, Leela. I think it's also a question I've been thinking through the book as well, and I think what I'm trying to do is not to divest it of sexuality, but I do divest it of identity in some ways, right? A sexual identity, so to speak. In fact, I say, you know, a more vulgar way of putting it, I say it's sexuality plus, and then because it's more than that, right? So I'm trying to say, well, also because the lives that I write about, the Fakir lives, in every chapter, one also gets a sense that these intimacies are inflecting the ways in which these people live their sexualities, right? Or their genders even. So it certainly has a very, and that's why the whole chapter about sexuality and sacrality, how they're conversant, complexly conversant. So they're not without, sexuality, but certainly these lives do not translate into sexual identity formations, and certainly not LGBT discourse. So the move is not to say that that we divested of sexuality, but to say the capaciousness comes from saying sexuality plus, more than sexuality, but something that does not cohere into or sediment into or lead us to claims of identity, so to speak.
Absolutely, that dissolution of identity being integral to the process of fakiri, as you describe it.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
We have a number of questions that have appeared. I will begin by asking the first one, which is from Muntazir Ali, who is a PhD student in religious studies here at Brown. Hi, Omar. Thanks so much for this wonderful talk. Got two questions for you. A, you briefly mentioned that the female identifying fakir contested place among the dead. Could you please say more about that? Second, I wonder if akraba, near ones, and qurbani, giving up something for something more valued, bringing those two terms, akraba and qurbani, into the discussion, especially in relation to Zahida's relationship with other fakirs and the saint, and your own relation to your own mother, might be in some way transformative.
Thank you, Muntazir, for these lovely questions. Contesting place among the dead. So the last chapter is set in a graveyard outside town, on the edge of town, basically, the northern edge, where two fakirs were in a dispute of sorts because they both had dreams and visions, which which led them to believe and claim that they were the caretakers of that place. And they were both also involved in material transformations of the place itself on the basis of these visions. And this idea of being among the dead, because it's a graveyard, the narratives that they had a lot of the times involved the inhabitants of the graveyard, right? Thinking about how they interacted with them or the conversations that they've had. Or one fakir was actually almost populating the graveyard, so to speak, over the years. Every time I would meet him, he would say, "Oh, I've unearthed another grave." And unearthing meant almost restoring it from other encroaching sites, and then saying, "Well, there used to be a grave here, so I'm going to build a grave," right? So it was this active investment in the life of the dead, so to speak, and the claims that emerged out of it. So I found that this idea of sort of having, and of course, it's also tied to this whole notion of renunciation and recluse, that you go and live in places that are not very sociable, and living among the dead is also a part of, I think, a hadith, that it's tied to this idea that die before you die. So Sufis and Fakirs use that hadith to qualify the idea that you should live in spaces that are actually inhabited by the dead. It's a corporeal performance of that death before dying, so to speak. So in that sense, that's what I meant. And these two fakirs were really, really interesting characters, very hard to pin down, but fascinating characters who were involved in this fight, also involving jinns and all of that, the mythic creatures, so to speak. Your other question is really, really, I have to think about it. I really like it. I mean, I do very briefly mention the notion of akraba, the kin-making aspect through intimacy, though I don't get into it, but I didn't want to leave it out. So it's there in the introduction, just a hint that it is one possible route to think about. But I never thought of Qurbani, to be very fair. And I think what you're asking me to do could help me in writing the text that I'm now, as I said, I'm trying to write this, about a lot about my kin making, or the disruptions that it makes, about my relationship with not just my mother, but also, romantic partners and stuff like that. How Seven has come to be the story of my queerness. And so, in the acknowledgements, I write this statement that I've come into my queer self not only in metropolises, because I'm Karachi raised, I'm academic by way of London, I'm a Berliner by love, as I like to claim, but my queerness is really stemming out from an ancient place of multi-faith devotion. And having written the acknowledgements, which one actually writes at the end, of course, I kept thinking I need to unpack this at some point. What is that story? So I think what you're giving me really helps me think about that. So thank you. It's not an answer, it's just saying I'm joyful about this.
Thank you. The next question is from Sarah Maddy, who appears as guest in my Q&A. She writes, "Thank you, Omar. This was most interesting. I work on similar shrines in late antiquity when they were more or less the norm. My question is the queerness a response to modernity and postcoloniality? Is the queerness a response to modernity and postcoloniality?" I know you hinted at that, but if you could elaborate a little, I look forward to reading the book as a whole.
Thank you, Sarah. I certainly place my reading in this kind of, let's say, post-colonial frame, because I think that, for example, when I was talking about the last chapter, I said that it allows certain kinds of histories to exist in the post-colony, or at least are made, however faintly, but somehow registered, right, through these performances and through these visions and through this whole affectivity that I'm trying to read. But I think, as you mentioned, that some of these shrines were the norm in certain periods of time, I would say that one can read queerness of these places, or figures like Qalandar, who were also figures of protest in their own times. So Qalandar is not a figure who has become queer, at least I'm talking about this particular place. He's not a figure that has become queer over the years, so to speak. Even though I don't say that the saint is queer and I don't say the fakirs are queer, I look at queerness in the relation, in the relationality of, I place it in intimacy, right? But just to say, I'm right now just using it as, as a tool to answer your question, that I think that our readings of queerness would depend on the time we're placing it in. But figures like Qalandar were already unstraight to the norm. They were unstraight to the larger Sufi brotherhoods that existed in the time. In fact, it was a response to the institutionalization of Sufism that these figures said, we're going to go and not be part of a group, and we're going to be these recluse figures. We'll be these how should I say, antinomian figures who wander the jungles, the deserted areas, and so on, and living on the edge of society, right? But people have also made the argument that living on the edge of society also creates something at the heart of, it's a critique also at the heart of society. So I don't want to create this, there is a relation between the center and the. So what I'm trying to say is that I have operationalized it to understand, or to speak back to the nation state in Pakistan. So yes, post-colonial and the idea of modernity does play a role. But I would say that it exists, this unstraightness exists throughout the story of this place, at least.
Thank you. And the next question is from Nanvi Vora, who is a graduate student in History of Art and Architecture. Thank you so much for such an effective talk. This is Nanvi. I'm interested in Murad's comments towards the end that he wanted to be like you. And in that context, I was wondering about the reciprocations or the idea of reciprocation from other fakirs. Also, I was wondering, is crossing the line that Zaida speaks about during your interactions with her specified as a theological concept in the Quran? Is this crossing the line connected to a more theological conception, arguably, of religion. And here she specifically mentions the concept in the Quran. That's it. Well done.
Thank you, Nenvi, for this question. I'll start with the crossing the line thing. Crossing the line is the statement that my mother makes. Zahida's use of the line always had to do, first of all, the first statement was, I am in the line of Fakiri, which as I tried to unpack was a lot about going somewhere, orientation, being on a path, rather than crossing transgression. Crossing transgression is for my mother because she thought this is a bit too risque. I've gone beyond what I should have gone, those kinds of things. And at least in my mother's use, none of these people brought up the Quran, at least in these conversations. And Zahida certainly did not. So at least no clear theological references were made in her description. A lot of the times she would have used or a variation of the term line to talk about dilemma. Once she said, when I take this train, I miss the other, something like that, right? She was very aware that orienting herself towards saintly objects, let's say, or pursuits, meant sort of, moving away from others, right? So she was very aware of this politics of orientation that lines brought in. She was also aware about what it meant to commit to a line, right? This idea of, and I also talk about how lines in the, there's an Urdu saying called Lakir ka Fakir, which basically means Fakir of the line, but it is a reference to, let's say, being short-sighted or not inventive about life, treading the path, like, blindfolded kind of thing, right? And the ways in which Fakirs use the word line is about commitments, about, staying the course. It's not about, these are people who actually take very radical decisions. So they're not people who are following the path blindly, but they're actually questioning lines, right? So I also talk about that. And these are things that I've learned from Fakirs, but crossing the line is not something that Fakirs use, I would say, or have used. On reciprocation, it's such a broad way of, right? It's a broad figure to think with. Different fakirs reciprocated in very different ways. I think women fakirs, I would say, was just so generous. They really understood somehow what I was trying to do. They were very generous, I think, in reciprocating in terms of the stories they gave me. They were very open about speaking about their body without me asking. I wasn't asking very interrogative questions. A lot of my work was just hanging out, because that's what I'd learned through fakir critique. So one reciprocity is also this, one of them said, why do you ask so many questions? Learn to sit by the sea and the sea will reveal its secrets unto you. Or one fakir was really upset when he saw a recording device and he gave me a long lecture about, he said, just take what you can, right? Why are you trying to take more than what you can? I learned through these interactions and, through these, let's say, reciprocities, that I have to just take what I can, right? I can just live in the moment in a sense and not worry about, taking something, extracting so much from the field, so to speak.
Right.
So,
thank you so much. Actually, we have a ton of more questions. I already pages filling up from the little bit of exchange that we've had time for here of questions, and I hope we can continue them this afternoon when you join us in our seminar. So in lieu of time, I'm just going to thank you very much for sharing with us your book. Congratulations again on it. It as a part of your larger body of work, which I'm eagerly anticipating, especially the companion book on a more personal note that thinks with queerness and companionship anew, with Seven at its center in some ways. We hopefully will get to stay in Seven for the rest of this afternoon and continue to think with you.
Thank you so
without
much.
further ado, thank you so much.
Thank
See
you.
you soon.
See you soon.
See you soon.